There is a document in an archive in Carcassonne, a parchment roll, about the length of a man's arm, written in a small, careful Latin hand sometime around the year 1302. It is a list of names. Beside each name, there is a date, the date of entry. And beside most of those dates, there is a second column, the date of release, of transfer, of ransom paid. But beside some of the names, the second column is blank, not crossed out, not filled in later, just a small horizontal mark, a dash, as if the clerk who kept the record had intended to come back and complete it, and never did, or as if the dash was the completion, the end of the entry, the end of the man. One of those names is listed as Guilhem, no family name, no title, artisan, entered on the feast of St. Andrew in the year of our Lord 1302, and beside his name, the dash, no date of release, no explanation, no record of death, just the dash and 700 years of silence after it. This is the story of what happened to a man in a medieval dungeon, not in a single hour, not in a single night, day by day, stone by stone. And the first thing you need to understand is the sound of an oak door, 4 inches thick, banded with iron, set into a frame of limestone, closing behind you in a corridor 6 feet wide and 12 feet underground. It is not a slam. It is a low, heavy thud, followed by an echo that lasts about 3 seconds, bouncing off walls that have been wet since they were built. And then the key, the scrape of iron in a lock that has never been oiled. And then nothing. The year is 1302. Philip IV sits on the throne of France, a king so consumed by debt and control that he will, within 5 years, arrest every Knight Templar in the country in a single night. In England, Edward the Frun is in the last years of his reign, building castles in Wales with dungeons designed by men who understood that darkness is cheaper than chains. Across Europe, the feudal system is at its peak, which is to say, the machinery for grinding a human being into silence is running smoothly, funded by taxes, blessed by the church, and administered by clerks who keep very good records. Prison, in 1302, is not what you think it is. It is not a sentence. It is not punishment in the modern sense. For most of its medieval history, imprisonment was a holding state. A man was kept in a cell while he waited for trial, or while his family gathered the ransom, or while the local lord decided what to do with him. The punishment itself was something else. A fine, a branding, a severed hand, the gallows. The cell was just the waiting room. But there was another kind of imprisonment. The kind that had no trial attached, no ransom expected, no sentence pronounced. The kind where a man was simply put away, placed in a hole beneath a fortress, fed just enough to remain alive, and left there until he wasn't alive anymore. The French had a word for the place where this happened. They called it an oubliette, from oublier, to forget. The architecture of an oubliette was deliberate. It was not a room that happened to be underground. It was a room built to be underground, carved into bedrock or set beneath the foundation stones of a tower, with a single opening in the ceiling, sometimes no wider than a man's shoulders. There were no stairs. The prisoner was lowered in by rope, or simply dropped. The ceiling height, in the oubliettes that survive, ranges from 4 feet to 6. Enough to sit, sometimes enough to stand, if you were short. Rarely enough to lie flat. The temperature, year-round, held steady at about 10 to 12 degrees, 50 to 54 in modern terms, not cold enough to kill, cold enough that your muscles never fully relaxed, that sleep never came easily, that the damp crept into your joints and stayed there like a second skeleton. There was no window. There was no torch. Fire consumed oxygen, and the ventilation in an oubliette was barely sufficient for breathing. The darkness was not the darkness of a bedroom with the curtains drawn. It was the darkness in which your hand, held 5 centimeters from your face, is invisible. total, permanent. The only break came when the hatch above opened and a bucket was lowered, food, water, and for a moment a rectangle of grey light that the prisoner had perhaps 30 seconds to memorize before it was gone again. This was the system. It was legal. It was ordinary. In the registers of dozens of castles across southern France, the costs of maintaining a dungeon appear alongside the costs of maintaining the stables. So much for straw, so much for bread, so much for water. The amounts are small. A man in an oubliette cost less to keep than a horse. Guilhem was, or so the records allow us to guess, about 30 years old. An artisan, a weaver of wool from Toulouse or its outskirts. The records do not say what he looked like, but the records of his trade do. A man who had spent 15 years at a loom had certain marks on him, the right shoulder slightly higher than the left, or the left lower, depending on which hand held the shuttle. Calluses on the fingers thick enough to crack in winter. A stoop from bending over the frame. He could not read. He almost certainly spoke Occitan, the language of the South, and understood some French, but little Latin. And the sentence that put him in the dungeon was read to him in Latin by a clerk who did not bother to translate it because translation was not required. His crime, as the register notes it, was debt. He owed money to a local seigneur, a feudal lord whose authority over justice in his territory was absolute. In 1302, a lord's court could imprison a debtor until the debt was paid or until the lord decided the matter was settled. There was no appeal. There was no maximum term. There was, in theory, a review process, a second hearing, months later, sometimes years. But the review depended on the lord remembering the case, or the clerk bringing it forward, or the prisoner's family petitioning. And Guilhem, so far as the record shows, had no family with the means or the knowledge to petition anyone. He was brought to the castle on a November morning. The guards who walked him in were not cruel, or rather, their cruelty was procedural, not personal. They did what they always did. They took his belt, his knife, his purse. They gave him a blanket of coarse wool, the kind that smelled of sheep fat and smoke and other men's sweat. They walked him down a spiral staircase cut into the rock, each step worn smooth by decades of feet going down. The staircase turned twice. The air changed. It went from cold to damp, from damp to something heavier, a smell like wet stone and moss and old iron, and beneath it, the faint sweetness of human waste that has been accumulating in a place with no drainage for a very long time. At the bottom, a corridor. Low ceiling. His head almost touched it. 3 doors on the left, 1 on the right. They opened the second door on the left. The cell was 8 feet by 6. The ceiling was just under 6 feet. The floor was stone, irregular, uneven, slick with a thin film of moisture that never dried. In the corner, a pile of straw that had been there long enough to begin composting. And on the wall, near the door, at about shoulder height, marks. Dozens of them, small vertical scratches, grouped in 5s, the way a man counts days when he has no calendar and no light and no other way to hold on to the shape of time. Some of the marks were deep, some were faint, some stopped abruptly. Remember this detail. It will matter later. Day 1. The door closes. The sound, that heavy, final thud, fills the corridor, and then fills the cell, and then fills Guilhem's chest. The key turns. The footsteps retreat. They get quieter. They stop. And then the silence begins. Not silence in the way a quiet room is silent. Silence in the way the bottom of a well is silent. A silence that has weight, that presses against the ears, that makes a man hear his own pulse as if it was someone else's. The darkness is immediate. He can see nothing. He reaches out. The wall is there, cold, wet, gritty under his fingers. He finds the straw. He sits. The cold of the stone floor comes through the blanket, through his clothes, through his skin, and settles into his bones within the first hour. He does not sleep. He cannot tell when night comes, because there is no night. There is only this. Day 2. The hatch above the corridor opens. A guard lowers a wooden bowl on a rope. Bread. Dark, dense, made from rye, already going stale. A cup of water. Guilhem has 30 seconds of grey light falling through the hatch, filtering under his door. He stares at the light, the way a drowning man stares at the surface. Then it is gone. He eats. The bread tastes of dust and grain, and nothing else. He begins to understand the straw. It is not bedding, it is insulation. Without it, the stone would leach the heat from his body faster than his body could make it. He arranges it beneath him. He pulls the blanket around his shoulders. He waits. For what? He does not know. Day 3. His body begins to speak. His lower back aches from the stone. His knees are stiff. The damp has found the old injury in his left shoulder, the one from the loom, and turned it into a constant, low-grade fire. He has begun to lose track of time. Without light, without meals at regular intervals, without any external rhythm, the body's clock begins to drift. An hour feels like 3. 3 hours feel like 1. He sleeps, wakes, and cannot tell if he slept for 10 minutes or 10 hours. He begins to make marks on the wall. He has no tool. He uses his fingernail. The stone is soft enough, barely, to accept a scratch if he presses hard enough, drags slowly enough. 1 mark. Day 1, or day 3. He isn't sure anymore. Day 5. He hears a voice. It comes from somewhere to his right. Another cell, maybe 2 cells down. A man singing. The language is Occitan, like his own. The melody is a troubadour song, old and slow, the kind sung at harvest. The voice is thin, it wavers, but it is human, and it is the first human sound Guilhem has heard since the door closed. He listens the way a man in a desert watches a cloud. The singing goes on for what feels like an hour. Then it stops. He waits for it to come again. It doesn't. Not that day. Day 7. The singing returns. This time it is different. A hymn in Latin, broken and mispronounced. The singer is not a cleric. The singer is someone who heard the hymn in church and remembered pieces of it, the way all of them did. Guilhem tries to call out. His voice, when it comes, sounds wrong. Hoarse, too loud in the small space, bouncing off the walls and coming back to him like a stranger's. The singing stops. Then, after a long pause, a voice says something. He cannot make out the words. The stone is too thick. But someone answered. Someone is there. Day 10. He has stopped being hungry in the usual way. The body, fed just enough and no more, adjusts. The bread comes. The water comes. He eats. He drinks. But the hunger has moved from his stomach to his mind. He thinks about food constantly, not the bread, but real food. A bowl of beans with pork fat, onions fried in oil, the smell of bread baking, actual bread, wheat bread, warm from the oven, the kind his wife made on Sundays. His wife. He thinks about her now in a way he did not think about her when he could see her every day. Her face is becoming abstract. He can remember her hands, the shape of them, the roughness of her palms, but her face is starting to blur. The darkness does that. Without visual input, the mind begins to lose its grip on images. The things you saw most recently fade first. The things you saw longest, childhood, early memories, stay the longest. He can still see his mother's kitchen. He is beginning to lose his wife's face. Day 14. The singing has become regular now. Every evening, or what passes for evening, the voice 3 cells down sings. Sometimes Occitan, sometimes broken Latin, sometimes just a melody without words. Guilhem waits for it the way he once waited for meals. It is the only structure in his day. He has made 14 marks on the wall, or 12. He lost count once and had to guess. The marks of the men before him stare back at him in the dark. Not that he can see them, but he knows they are there. He felt them with his fingers on the first day. Some stopped at 20, some at 40. One set of marks near the floor went past 100 and then stopped. What does a man think about on the 101st day in a hole in the ground? The records do not say. The records on this question are silent. Day 18. Something changes. The guard who lowers the food is different. A younger voice, less careful with the rope. The bread is smaller. The water tastes of rust. Guilhem has begun talking to himself. Not in madness, not yet, but in the way a man talks to himself when there is no one else to confirm that he exists. He says his own name. He says the names of his children. He says the days of the week, though he no longer knows which day it is. He recites the only prayer he knows by heart, the Pater Noster, in bad Latin, the same bad Latin the singer uses. He says it not because he believes God is listening, but because the sound of a human voice, even his own, pushes the silence back a few inches. Day 21. A commotion in the corridor. Voices, keys, the sound of a door opening. Not his door, but the one across the hall. A man's voice, speaking French rapidly, with authority. Then footsteps going up. Then quiet. The night. The one who had been in the cell across from him. The one whose family had money has been ransomed. Guilhem knows this because the system is simple. If you can pay, you leave. If you cannot pay, you stay. And Guilhem cannot pay. He presses his face against the crack beneath his door. For a moment he can smell fresh air. Actual air from above, carried down by the opened hatch, cold and clean and carrying the scent of wood smoke and rain. Then the hatch closes. The air goes stale again. He does not cry. He is past crying. Crying requires a belief that someone might hear. Day 28. The singing has changed. The voice is weaker now. The melodies are slower, with longer pauses between phrases. Sometimes the singer stops mid-word and doesn't start again for what feels like hours. Guilhem begins to sing back. His voice is terrible, cracked, thin, uncertain. But he sings the same harvest song the other man sang on day 5. And from 3 cells down, very faintly, the voice joins him. They sing together for perhaps 2 minutes. It is, and here is where the narration pauses, because the word needs to be chosen carefully. It is the most human thing that happens in this story. 2 men, in the dark, in the cold, singing a song about wheat. Day 33. The voice stops, not between phrases, not at the end of a song. It simply stops, the way a clock stops, mid-tick, between one moment and the next. Guilhem waits. He calls out. He sings the harvest song alone. Nothing. He sings it again the next day. Nothing. And the next. Nothing. The silence that follows is different from the silence that came before. Before, the silence was empty. Now it is full. Full of a man who used to sing and doesn't anymore. Gone. The voice is gone. Day 35. Guilhem stops eating, not as a decision, not as a protest. He simply does not reach for the bowl when it is lowered. The bread sits in the straw. The water sits beside it. The guard notices, or doesn't. The bread is taken back the next day, untouched. This happens twice. On the 3rd time, a different guard comes down. There is a brief exchange at the door. A hand reaches in and places the bowl closer. That is the extent of the intervention. There is no physician. There is no inquiry. The records of the castle for that month show a marginal note. One prisoner refusing food. Cost of bread saved. 3 deniers. Day 38. He eats again. The body overrides the mind. The stomach demands. He eats the stale bread and drinks the rusty water and feels the nutrients enter his blood like a slow, unwanted rescue. He hates it. He hates that his body wants to live when his mind has begun to let go. Day 40. He makes his last mark on the wall. He does not know it is the last. He presses his fingernail into the stone, drags it down. The nail is worn almost to the quick by now, the finger raw, and makes the 40th line, or the 38th. He has lost count, and the losing of the count is itself a kind of death. The marks were the last structure, the last calendar, the last proof that time was passing and that he was inside it. Without the marks, there is no day 41. There is only the dark, and here is where the records go quiet. The parchment in Carcassonne lists his name, lists his entry date, lists the dash. It does not list what happened after day 40. It does not list a death. It does not list a release. It does not list a transfer. The clerk who kept the record moved on to the next name, and the next, and the next. Guilhem became the dash. The dash became the silence, and the silence became 700 years. How long can a man survive in total darkness, on bread and water, in a stone cell at 12 degrees? The answer, from the records that do exist, from the cases where dates of entry and dates of death were both recorded, is longer than you would think, and shorter than you would hope. Weeks, sometimes months, rarely more than a year. The body can endure cold and hunger and darkness for a very long time. The mind cannot. What breaks first is not the heart or the lungs or the stomach. What breaks first is the sense of self, the ability to know who you are when there is nothing around you to confirm it. No face, no voice, no light, no name spoken aloud. The man in the dark becomes a body in the dark, and the body, eventually, stops. The cell is found, not in 1302, not in 1310, but decades later, when the castle changes hands, when a new lord orders the lower levels inspected, when a clerk with a lantern descends the spiral staircase and opens doors that have not been opened in years. What he finds, in the cells, is documented in the dry language of inventory. Bones, straw, a blanket, rotted. In one cell, Guilhem's cell, or a cell very like it, a wall covered in marks, 40 of them, and a small object on the floor, an iron nail about 2 inches long, worn smooth at the tip. The nail had been used to make the marks. Where the nail came from, pulled from the door, or smuggled in, or found in the straw, the record does not say. It was listed among the contents of the cell, between straw, rotted, and one blanket, wool, unusable. An inventory item. The last tool of a man who had no tools. The costs were tallied. That is what survives most clearly from medieval dungeons. Not the suffering, but the accounting. Bread, 2 deniers per day. Water, drawn from the castle well, no additional cost. Straw, replaced quarterly when replaced at all. Guard wages, allocated across all prisoners, fractional cost per head. The total expense of keeping a man in an oubliette for 1 year was less than the cost of a decent horse. It was, by the standards of the administration, efficient. The first chronicler to write about conditions in these cells was not a reformer. He was a monk, a Benedictine, writing in the 1340s, compiling a history of the region. He described the oubliettes beneath the fortress with the same measured tone he used for crop yields and property disputes. The prisoners, he wrote, were kept in darkness. Some went mad, some did not. Some were released after months or years, some were not. He did not editorialize, he did not need to. The facts, written plainly, were enough. The silence that fills these cells after the last prisoner is removed is a specific kind of silence. It is not peaceful. It is not the silence of a church or a forest. It is the silence of a place where sound was the only companion a man had. And now even that is gone. The water still drips. It dripped in 1302. It drips now. The stone is still cold. The air is still damp. The marks are still on the walls. And the straw, if you could somehow reach back through the centuries and touch it, would still smell of mold and sheep fat and human desperation. A smell that no amount of time has fully erased from the stones themselves. The dungeons of Carcassonne are open to visitors today. You can walk through them. You can descend the spiral staircase, the same worn steps, and stand in the corridor where the cells were. The ceilings are low. The air is cool, even in August. A guide will tell you about the oubliettes. You will nod. You will take a photograph. You will leave. The visit takes about 20 minutes, but the marks are still there. On the walls of the cells that survive, behind glass now, preserved and labelled, the scratch marks of men who counted their days in the dark are still visible. Some are deep, made with a nail or a stone chip or a piece of iron pried from a hinge. Some are faint, made with a fingernail by a man who had nothing else. They are grouped in fives, the way we still group tally marks today. The system has not changed in 7 centuries. A man in the dark counts the same way a child in a classroom counts. 5 lines. Cross. 5 lines. Cross. And then, in some cases, the lines stop. Not at a round number, not at the end of a row. They just stop, and the wall, after the last mark, is blank. The word dungeon comes from the Old French donjon, which originally meant the Lord's Tower, the highest point of the castle, the place of power and visibility. Somewhere between the 12th century and the 15th, the word migrated. It moved from the top of the castle to the bottom, from the place where the Lord looked out over his lands to the place where the forgotten were kept beneath them. The word itself made the same descent as the prisoner. It went down, and it stayed down, and it never came back up. You can touch those walls. Many people have. The stone is cold under your hand, even now, even in summer. And if you stand in the corridor long enough, after the tour group has moved on, after the guide's voice has faded up the staircase, you will hear it. The sound that Guilhem heard, that every man in that corridor heard, that the walls have absorbed and held for 7 centuries. The drip of water on stone, steady, irregular, unending, the only clock a man in the dark ever had. The parchment roll is still in the archive. The names are still legible. The dates of entry are still clear. And beside some of those names, beside Guilhem's name, the dash is still there. Small, horizontal, final. No date of release, no explanation. Just the mark a clerk made when there was nothing left to write. A dash and 700 years of silence after it.